In this video, we're going to talk about the psychology of money, wealth, and income. We all know the song Money Can't Buy Me Love, and other popular sayings like money doesn't buy happiness. That's the conventional wisdom. And I'm not saying it's totally wrong, but it's worth stopping for a second to ask ourselves, why do we believe this? After all, isn't it better to be wealthy than to be poor? Maybe the more nuanced viewpoint on this question is not whether money buys well being, but what factors associated with money are more likely to make us feel happy. In this video, I will argue that money and well being depend on how much you have, how you get it, and how you spend it. Here is a correlation showing the association between money in terms of income and happiness or well being. So on the x axis, we have the amount of money people earn, and on the y axis, their well being. And what these data show us is that money does improve people's well being up to a point, and then it kind of levels off. We call this a curvilinear trend because the association between money and happiness doesn't keep going forever. It basically shows a plateauing effect, such that after a certain amount of money, it doesn't matter if you have more, your well being's not going to improve after that, at least psychologically. This means that money does, in fact, buy happiness if you're starting out from a point where it's difficult to make ends meet. If you're at the low point of the socioeconomic spectrum, having more money will help you. But if you're a very rich person, then excess wealth will not buy the same amount of happiness. So, why would having more money be good for people's well being? One reason is that it has to do with a sense of achievement when income is earned. It's like the psychological payoff for hard work and effort. Another reason is that money typically correlates with social status, hence the term socioeconomic status, which means having the respect of others in your community and society. Rich individuals tend to occupy higher social positions and command more respect from others around them. A third factor is personal control, which is in some sense related to self determination theory. Money plays an instrumental role in helping people to solve problems and to have the kind of life that they want. For instance, if you have a longer commute, money can pay to help move you to another home that's closer to your work. Money can also pay for medicine or car repairs or vacations. And speaking of vacations, money can also afford people buying material goods, like a new smartphone, video games, toys for your pets, clothes, and more. And research does show that people derive pleasure from shopping. And finally, money gives people the chance to be altruistic, to give to other people in need, which usually makes people feel pretty good. We'll talk more about altruistic spending in a little bit. But first, before we get there, why would there be diminishing returns for higher income? In other words, why wouldn't the correlation just keep going such that higher income would always make people happier? Part of the reason might be adaptation. In other words, as people get wealthier, they tend to adapt to their circumstances, and so having that excess wealth doesn't provide greater joy. A related answer to adaptation is that while people might feel less negative emotion in their lives if they have more money, for instance, less stress and worry about finances, they might not feel more positive emotion or pleasure just because they have more money. Money can help with some aspects of well being, but not others. And finally, money can have damaging impacts on people's social relationships. Your textbook also calls attention to the way in which people at all socioeconomic levels might engage in social comparison. For someone who's wealthy, but whose friends and others in their social network are even wealthier than them, they can feel really bad by comparison. The textbook authors suggest that happiness is a function of what we have and also what we want. If we have more than what we want, then we'll be happy. But if we want more than we have, we'll be unhappy. Here are other factors that are associated with money and well being. One is materialism. Materialism, simply put, is wanting money and material goods more than you want other things, such as love or leisure time. Of course, all people want a good income, but materialistic people think that money is the most important thing in their life. Most studies show that people high in materialism are less happy. The happiness of materialists can suffer because their pursuit of money distracts them from other important aspects of their life, such as relationships. Other studies show that people are happier to the extent that they earn their wealth rather than inherit it. And there is some research showing that when people grow up with a lot of wealth and privilege in their childhood, this can have damaging psychological effects. Here's a quote from your textbook. Unfortunately, because many children grow so accustomed to comfort and luxury, they experience extra pressure to excel in pursuits that will allow them to continue that kind of lifestyle. If a child becomes too accustomed to luxury, his or her freedom can be limited because lower paying but rewarding jobs such as art and teaching are psychologically off limits. Finally, wealthy young people are sometimes given the idea of entitlement, and they feel that they're better than others. As mentioned earlier, the associations between money and happiness can depend on how we spend our money. And research by Mike Norton shows that when people spend money on gifts for other people and on time savers, those things tend to make people happier than spending money on themselves or on material goods. And some of this is based on experiments that show true causality. For example, the researchers will give $5 or $20 to some participants and tell them, spend this on yourself, and then they'll randomly assign other people to get the same money, but they'll be told, spend this on a gift for other people, or spend it on a time saver, for example, hiring someone to clean your home or to get groceries for you. And what they find consistently in these studies is that spending money on others and on time savers increase well-being, sometimes by giving people the added pleasure of helping others or doing something kind, or reducing the subjective sense of time pressure. Now, so far we've talked about individual wealth and income, but what about wealth in societies? Is it the case that richer societies function better? And would that predict people's well-being in richer versus poorer countries? What's interesting is that we observe a very similar curvilinear correlation between national wealth and well-being as we see with individual wealth and well-being. So as you can see at the lower end of GDP on the left side of the x-axis, we see that countries that have less money tend to be less happy. And as countries get more money, they tend to be happier up to a point at which happiness kind of levels off. And we see the same plateauing effect that we saw before. So if you're a country that already has enough money, then having excess wealth won't make people happier. Now, if money buys happiness in nations up to a point, again, we see this curvilinear effect, so it doesn't have the same effect for wealthy nations. But for poor nations, if money could buy them a little extra happiness, do increases in economic growth predict greater well-being? The answer to this appears to be no, and this is known as the Easterlin paradox, which is formulated by economist Richard Easterlin. We see, for example, evidence of a flat line for countries like the United States in terms of well-being over the past century, despite getting richer and richer. Now, why might this be the case? If we see that money is correlated with well-being in nations up to a point, why would it be the case that economic growth does not produce greater well-being? Part of this could be explained by income inequality. Income inequality is identified as the gap between the richest and the poorest people in a given society. And we see evidence that as income inequality goes up, national well-being goes down. So there appears to be a trend here that could explain why a country having more money would not necessarily increase in their happiness. If that wealth is concentrated at the very top by only the richest people, then the average person in this society will not benefit. We can also see further evidence for this trend by looking at egalitarianism across countries around the world. Egalitarian nations have happier citizens, and this is explained by their satisfaction with public goods and services, which is a function of progressive taxation. Progressive taxation means a higher tax rate for the richest people in society compared to the poorest people, and this money would help pay for things like public transportation, the school system, healthcare, roads and highways, good affordable housing, air and water quality, and many other things that are essential for a society to run. And it seems that to the extent that countries engage in progressive taxation, this does benefit them in terms of well being.